5 years later, after their one-night stand, CEO saw her with a child begging on the street. What happened next? Welcome back to Fusty Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Susan Raymond's life had been marked by hardship from the moment she lost her mother at the age of 12. Her late mother, Clara Raymond, was a gentle woman who ran a small flower shop, teaching Susan to find joy in the scent of roses and the colors of tulips, even when money was scarce. Her father had passed away earlier, leaving only her mother's love as a shield from the world's cruelty. But when Clara succumbed to a sudden illness, Susan's fragile safety net vanished. Left in the care of her stepmother, Vivian Eric, Susan's life turned into a storm of misery. Vivian was not the nurturing guardian Susan needed. She was a woman consumed by greed and envy, resenting Susan for her beauty and the resemblance she bore to Clara. Vivian constantly reminded Susan that she was nothing but a burden, someone who ate food she hadn't earned, and someone who didn't deserve a roof over her head. As the years passed, Susan's dreams of studying art and becoming a designer grew dimmer under the weight of Vivian's cruelty. Vivian had a daughter of her own, Pamela Eric, a spoiled and arrogant girl who never missed an opportunity to mock Susan's patched dresses or secondhand shoes. While Pamela flaunted new clothes, perfumes, and parties, Susan was forced to clean the house, wash laundry, and run errands until her hands cracked. Neighbors often whispered about the unfair treatment, but no one dared confront Vivian, who had a reputation for sharp words and a manipulative tongue. Susan's only comfort came from sketching with a broken pencil on scraps of paper she collected from trash bins. She drew dresses she would never wear, buildings she would never own, and families that would never mock her. Those sketches were the remnants of her late mother's encouragement. Dream, Susan. Even if the world cages you, your dreams can never be stolen. But Vivian was determined to break even those dreams. One evening, after catching Susan drawing by candlelight instead of scrubbing floors, Vivian snatched the sketches and tore them apart, laughing as Susan begged for mercy. "Dreams don't put food on the table, girl," she hissed. "If you want to stay in this house, you'll start earning money like a real woman. Men out there will pay. Bring me cash or pack your things by the end of the week." Those words were not just a threat. They were a command that sliced through Susan's innocence. With nowhere to run, no family to turn to, and no means to survive alone, Susan realized her life was at crossroads. Either obey Vivian's cruel ultimatum or be cast into the streets without a single coin. That night, she cried herself to sleep, clutching the necklace her mother had left her, praying for strength in a world that offered her none. Richard Vincent was the kind of man who seemed to have everything. At just 31, he was the CEO of Vincent Group, a multinational conglomerate with investments ranging from real estate to high-end fashion. He lived in a penthouse overlooking the heart of London, drove the fastest cars, and had his name etched into magazines as one of Europe's most eligible billionaires. Yet behind the tailored suits and powerful boardroom presence, Richard carried a hidden emptiness. His father, Harold Vincent, had been a ruthless businessman, drilling into Richard the mantra that success required sacrifice. Richard's mother had left when he was young, unable to endure Harold's coldness, leaving Richard with a hollow longing for maternal warmth. As an adult, he had learned to bury that longing under layers of work and fleeting pleasures. The women who orbited Richard's world were drawn by his wealth and reputation, but he never truly connected with them. He had grown accustomed to casual flings, often choosing one-night stands after stressful workdays to escape the suffocating weight of his empire. His closest confidant was Daniel Carter, his childhood friend turned legal advisor, who constantly warned Richard about the dangers of using people as emotional bandages. "You're building walls, Richard," Daniel often said during their late-night drinks. "One day, you'll meet someone who will make those walls crumble, and you'll regret all the chances you wasted." Richard would usually laugh it off, hiding behind his whiskey glass, but deep down, he wondered if Daniel was right. The boardroom victories, the headlines, and the applause meant little when he returned to an empty penthouse. On the day Susan's fate began to intertwine with his, Richard had just concluded a brutal negotiation that left him drained. His company had secured a massive contract, but the process had worn him out. That night, he sought relief in his usual way, slipping into an upscale bar, looking for someone who could distract him from the weight of responsibility. As the jazz music played and the smell of cigars filled the air, Richard noticed a girl sitting nervously in a corner, her hands clutched around a small bag. Unlike the confident socialites who usually filled such places, she looked fragile, almost out of place, her eyes darting around like a trapped bird. There was something hauntingly different about her, something pure and unpolished. For the first time in years, Richard's interest wasn't born out of lust or habit. It was curiosity. He leaned back in his seat, signaling for another drink, all the while keeping his eyes fixed on her, sensing that this night was about to be different from all others. Vivian Eric had always prided herself on being a survivor in a world she believed punished the weak. Once a social climber who married Susan's father for his modest wealth, Vivian found herself embittered after his death, managing debts and maintaining appearances in a neighborhood that thrived on gossip. To her, Susan was not just a stepchild. She was a reminder of Clara, the woman Vivian had never measured up to in beauty or kindness. This resentment grew into cruelty. While Pamela, her biological daughter, enjoyed lavish outings, new clothes, and social gatherings, Susan was treated like a servant in her own home. Vivian's bitterness sharpened when her finances worsened. Her gambling habits and pursuit of luxury drained the family income, and the small inheritance left behind was nearly gone. That's when Vivian turned her calculating eyes towards Susan. If Susan could not bring in money, she was useless in Vivian's eyes. One evening, after Pamela returned from party, laughing about her suitors and gifts, Vivian called Susan into her room. Her voice was cold and commanding. "You're no longer a child, Susan," she said, eyeing her with disdain. "You sit here, eating food, wearing clothes I provide, and giving me nothing in return. If you want to stay under my roof, you'll earn it." Susan's confusion turned to fear as Vivian spelled it out. She was to go out, find men who would pay for her company, and return with money. If she refused, she would be cast into the streets by dawn. Pamela, standing in the doorway with a smirk, added salt to the wound. "Honestly, Mom, she should be grateful. At least she's good for something. No one's going to marry her anyway." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, but Vivian remained unmoved. For her, it was simple economics. If Susan could be exploited, then so be it. That night, Susan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, clutching the necklace her late mother had given her. The silver locket, scratched but precious, contained a faded photograph of Clara smiling. It was the last shred of hope she had. "What would you do, Mama?" she whispered, but silence answered. She had no friends to turn to, no family who would shelter her. The streets outside seemed colder than ever, and her stepmother's threats echoed in her ears. She understood what Vivian demanded, but the thought made her tremble with shame. Still, the prospect of homelessness was worse. Vivian had cornered her into a nightmare. Either obey or be discarded like trash. As Susan cried herself to sleep, fate prepared to push her into Richard Vincent's path, a collision of two broken worlds. The city pulsed with nightlife as Susan walked nervously through the neon-lit streets the next evening. Vivian's ultimatum weighed on her like chains, and though every fiber of her being resisted the path she was on, desperation guided her steps. She ended up in an upscale bar, its glowing entrance intimidating yet strangely inviting. She had never been in such a place before. The air smelled of cigars and expensive whiskey. Laughter rang from private booths, and chandeliers sparkled like captured stars. Susan felt out of place in her simple dress, one Vivian had forced her to wear for this task, a cheap imitation of glamour that did little to hide her innocence. Her hands clutched her small bag, her eyes darting as though expecting someone to call her out and cast her away. Richard Vincent, meanwhile, was seated at the far end of the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon. The day had been taxing, a multi-billion-dollar deal closed, shareholders satisfied, but his soul left weary. He scanned the room absently, expecting nothing more than the usual routine. A drink, a brief distraction, and silence at dawn. But when his eyes landed on Susan, something in him stirred. Unlike the women who usually frequented such places, dripping in jewels and confidence, she seemed different. Fragile. Her nervous movements betrayed a story untold, and her natural beauty seemed unpolished, untouched by the world of artificiality he was used to. His curiosity sharpened into intrigue. Summoning his usual charm, Richard signaled for the bartender to send a drink her way. Susan hesitated, her eyes widening as the glass was placed before her. Their gazes met across the dimly lit room, his piercing, hers timid yet captivating. With hesitant steps, she approached his table, her voice trembling as she greeted him. Richard found himself smiling, amused by her awkwardness, yet inexplicably drawn to her authenticity. They spoke briefly, his questions probing, her answers stumbling, but beneath it all was an unspoken current pulling them together. For Richard, it was an unusual spark. For Susan, it was the beginning of a nightmare she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. Richard's penthouse was a monument of wealth, towering above the city skyline. Susan entered reluctantly, her steps echoing against marble floors, her heart pounding in fear. She had no intention of this night turning intimate, yet Vivian's threats echoed in her ears, "Bring me money or pack your things." Richard, already tipsy from earlier drinks, grew bolder as the night went on. He offered her wine, which she refused, sitting stiffly on the edge of a leather sofa. Richard, misinterpreting her nervousness as shyness, leaned closer, complimenting her beauty. But when he tried to kiss her, Susan recoiled, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded, "Please, I can't. I've never done this before. My stepmother forced me here. Please don't." Her words startled him, but the haze of alcohol dulled his empathy. He frowned, feeling mocked, believing she was fabricating a story to avoid intimacy. His pride as a man, fueled by intoxication, overrode the gentle curiosity he had felt earlier. "If you don't want this, then leave," he said coldly, gesturing toward the door. "But don't expect a dime from me." Susan froze. Vivian's words echoed, "Bring me money or leave my house forever." The image of homelessness loomed, cruel and immediate. Trembling, she nodded, surrendering to a fate she couldn't control. The hours that followed left Susan broken, her innocence stolen in a night she would never forget. Richard, falling asleep in his drunken haze, barely noticed her quiet sobs. At dawn, before the sun rose, Susan slipped from his bed, her hands shaking as she clutched her torn dress. She left without touching the envelope of money on the table, unable to accept payment for her pain. All she took was her dignity in fragments and the locket still around her neck. On the bedsheet remained a red stain, a silent testimony of the truth she had tried to tell him. Richard stirred awake moments after she fled, groggy, but the sight before him struck like a blade. The stain, the silence, the emptiness. His gaze fell on the necklace lying forgotten on the floor. In that instant, his drunken fog cleared and horror dawned. She had been telling the truth. Richard leapt from his bed, clutching the necklace as if it held the answer to his guilt. Shame and regret flooded him. He had ignored her pleas, dismissed her truth, and now she was gone. The locket felt heavy in his palm, an unwanted reminder of a girl whose innocence he had shattered. He swore to himself that he would find her, not only to return the necklace, but to beg forgiveness. For weeks, he searched bars, hotels, and every corner of the city, but Susan had vanished without a trace. His frustration deepened into obsession, yet all he had was the silver locket and the memory of her tear-filled eyes. Meanwhile, Susan wandered the city with no destination. She could not return to Vivian, knowing she would face scorn and cruelty for coming back empty-handed. The betrayal she felt from Richard cut deeper than Vivian's threats. He had seen her pain, heard her pleas, yet ignored them. Alone, homeless, and broken, she found refuge in abandoned buildings, surviving on scraps, her faith in humanity shattered. The necklace she once treasured was gone, lost in Richard's penthouse, as though the last piece of her mother had been stolen. Susan's nights were sleepless, haunted by shame, and her days filled with desperate searches for work that never came. She learned quickly that the world had little mercy for women like her, poor, unprotected, and vulnerable. But within her, a flicker of resilience remained. When she realized she had missed her cycle for 2 months, fear twisted into certainty. She was pregnant. Susan's discovery of her pregnancy marked the beginning of a new chapter in her suffering. She sat in a small clinic, her trembling hands gripping the doctor's note confirming what her instincts had already told her. A child. Richard Vincent's child. She was only 19, penniless, and abandoned. The thought of raising a child on the streets terrified her, yet she could not bring herself to end the life growing within her. "You'll be my reason to live," she whispered to her belly, already naming the unborn baby David after her late father. The following months were brutal. With no stable shelter, Susan worked odd jobs where she could, washing clothes, cleaning stalls, carrying loads for market women. Her body ached, yet she pressed on, determined to bring her child into the world. People stared at her with pity or scorn, but she ignored them, her love for the baby shielding her from despair. When the time came, she delivered David in a poorly funded hospital, screaming through the pain without a single hand to hold. But when she saw his tiny face, When she felt his small fingers clutch hers, tears of joy replaced the agony. For the first time in years, she smiled. Meanwhile, Richard had not stopped searching. He sent private investigators with descriptions, posted discreet inquiries, and scoured the city. Yet the girl remained elusive. He often stared at the necklace, wondering if fate would ever bring her back. He didn't know she was out there, carrying the child he had unknowingly fathered, struggling to survive in a world far removed from his empire of glass towers. Raising David was the greatest challenge Susan had ever faced. She became both mother and father, protector and provider, yet the streets were merciless. She often went hungry so her son could eat. Some nights they slept under bridges, other nights in abandoned warehouses. When jobs became scarce, Susan resorted to begging, holding her son close as they pleaded with strangers for coins. Pride no longer mattered, David's survival did. She sang to him when he cried, told him stories about angels when he asked about a father she couldn't describe, and shielded him from the cold with her tattered shawl. As David grew, his laughter became Susan's light in the darkness. He was curious, playful, and intelligent beyond his years. But the sight of her son begging on the pavement often tore Susan apart. She felt as though she had failed him, even though she gave all she had. Vivian and Pamela were distant shadows now, living their lives untouched by her suffering. Yet Susan often wondered if they ever thought about the girl they had cast away. Richard, in another world, was thriving. Vincent Group expanded into America and Asia, his name synonymous with power. The media celebrated him as a titan, yet he felt the hollowness of victory more acutely with each passing year. His wealth grew, but his nights remained restless. He often stared out from his penthouse balcony, the locket clutched in his hand, whispering, "Where are you?" Richard's empire became unstoppable. His ventures dominated industries, from luxury fashion to cutting-edge technology. He was admired, feared, and envied, yet his personal life remained barren. Business partners paraded their wives and children at galas, while Richard attended alone, a smile hiding the ache in his heart. He had grown weary of meaningless flings, each leaving him emptier than before. Daniel Carter noticed the change and often urged him to settle down, but Richard shook his head. "I can't," he said. "Not until I find her." His friends thought it was obsession, but Richard knew it was guilt mixed with an inexplicable connection he couldn't erase. The necklace remained in his desk drawer, untouched by anyone but him. At night, he sometimes dreamed of Susan's tear-stained face, and in those dreams, he always tried to say the words he hadn't said that night. "I'm sorry." He had no idea she had borne his son, no idea fate was preparing to crash their worlds together once more. It was a rainy afternoon when Richard's convoy slowed at a busy intersection. From the tinted glass of his car, he glanced absently at the crowd of pedestrians. But then he froze. There, huddled on the sidewalk, was a woman holding a child's hand, their clothes soaked, their hands outstretched in desperate plea. The boy's eyes, bright, familiar, haunting, stared into Richard's soul. His gaze shifted to the woman, and his heart stopped. Susan, the girl he had searched for, the girl who had vanished into the night, the girl whose necklace he still held. 5 years had passed, but she was unmistakable. Richard's chest tightened, his breath quickened. "Stop the car," he ordered. His guards hesitated, confused, but he was insistent. He stepped out into the rain, his expensive suit instantly drenched, yet he cared nothing for appearances. As he approached, Susan's eyes widened in horror. She grabbed David's hand, as if to shield him from the man who had once broken her. Richard stood before them, his voice trembling. "It's you, after all these years." Susan's face hardened, her voice icy. "Stay away from us." But before she could turn, David looked up at Richard with innocent curiosity. "Mama, who is this man?" That single question struck Richard harder than any blow. For the first time, he saw not just Susan, but his son. Rain poured heavily as Richard stood face to face with Susan and David, his heart pounding with emotions he could not contain. He had imagined this reunion 1,000 times, but none of his thoughts matched the raw reality of seeing her soaked in rags, clutching the hand of a boy who bore his own features. Susan's eyes blazed with anger, not relief. Her lips quivered as she said, "Haven't you done enough?" Every word was an arrow to Richard's conscience. He wanted to explain, to beg forgiveness, but the bitterness in her gaze silenced him. He knelt before David, stunned at how the child mirrored his own childhood photographs, and whispered, "What's your name?" David, shy but curious, replied softly, "David." The name struck Richard like fate's cruel joke, the same name as Susan's late father. Susan tried to pull her son away, but David resisted, drawn by the stranger who seemed familiar. Richard's guards watched in confusion, unsure why their boss was drenched in rain speaking to beggars, but Richard waved them off. "Susan, please," he said, his voice cracking, "let me explain. I searched for you. I never stopped searching." But Susan's heart had hardened over 5 years of suffering. "You didn't listen when I begged you," she spat. "You had your chance. Now, leave us alone." Richard's chest tightened. This was not a business deal he could negotiate, not a boardroom where power bent wills. This was a battlefield of broken trust, and he was losing. David's innocent voice cut through the tension. "Mama, do you know him?" Susan's throat tightened. She wanted to say no, to erase Richard from their lives forever, but the boy's curious gaze held her captive. Richard seized the moment, gently saying, "I'm someone who should have been here for you both all along." Susan's heart wavered, but anger pushed her forward. She grabbed David's hand and stormed off into the rain, leaving Richard standing drenched and devastated, clutching the ghost of what might have been. Yet deep inside, he vowed he would not lose them again, not now, not ever. News of Susan's street encounter with a powerful CEO spread faster than wildfire through the gossip chains of the city. Vivian Eric, now struggling with debts and clinging to the fading glamour of her social circles, caught wind of it. Greed sparked instantly in her eyes. If Susan had indeed borne the child of Richard Vincent, one of the wealthiest men alive, then there was money to be made. Pamela, now grown into a woman who had inherited her mother's arrogance and hunger for status, fueled her ambition. "Mother, this is our chance. If Susan has ties to him, we can leverage it. He'll have no choice but to acknowledge us." Vivian smiled wickedly. "She owes us everything. Without me, she'd have starved years ago. If anyone deserves a share, it's us." Vivian began plotting, contacting old acquaintances in high society, weaving lies about how she had raised Susan selflessly despite her ungrateful nature. She framed herself as a suffering benefactor who deserved compensation. Pamela, on the other hand, began fantasizing about seducing Richard herself. "Why should Susan get him?" she sneered. "She's nothing but a beggar. I could be the perfect match for a man like Richard." Vivian encouraged her daughter's schemes, seeing them as avenues to wealth. Susan, meanwhile, was unaware of her stepmother's reemergence. She struggled daily to feed David, turning away every attempt Richard made to help. She refused his money, his shelter, even his food offerings. Pride and fear made her stubborn. She did not trust that his sudden remorse was genuine. Yet Richard persisted, following at a distance, leaving anonymous donations she never accepted. His determination only grew when he overheard Vivian speaking at a high-end club, boasting about her plans to reclaim Susan and David. Rage boiled within him. He knew Susan had suffered enough, and he would not allow Vivian to exploit her again. The battlefield of betrayal was shifting, and Vivian was sharpening her knives. Richard realized that words alone could not bridge the chasm Susan had built between them. He approached her cautiously one morning, while David played with a stick by the roadside. "Susan," he began gently, "I know you don't trust me, but let me prove the truth. Let's take a paternity test." His words hit her like thunder. The thought of exposing David to Richard's powerful world terrified her, yet part of her longed for validation, for proof that her suffering had not been in vain. After hours of arguments, she reluctantly agreed. The process was grueling. At the clinic, David clung to Susan, confused by the needles and machines. Richard tried to comfort him with small gifts, but Susan intercepted, not wanting her son to grow attached too quickly. Days later, the results arrived: David Vincent, biological son of Richard Vincent. The paper burned in Susan's hands, undeniable and irreversible. Richard's heart soared, yet Susan sank. This confirmation meant her fragile world would never be the same. Vivian seized upon the news, twisting it to her advantage. She barged into Susan's life, pretending concern. "Oh, my poor stepdaughter, I always knew you'd end up important," she cooed falsely, her eyes gleaming with greed. Susan recoiled, but Vivian pressed on, demanding introductions to Richard and making veiled threats. Pamela, meanwhile, began plotting her moves to insert herself into Richard's orbit, attending galas where she knew he would appear, flaunting herself shamelessly. The revelation of truth had set events in motion, and Susan realized she was caught in a storm larger than she had ever imagined. Richard's persistence finally broke Susan's walls. He invited her and David into his penthouse, not as charity, but as family. Reluctantly, Susan agreed. David deserved a roof over his head and meals without begging. Walking into Richard's world was like stepping into another planet. The chandeliers, marble floors, and panoramic city views overwhelmed Susan, who had spent years sleeping on sidewalks. David, on the other hand, ran joyfully through the halls, his laughter echoing against the walls, filling Richard's heart with warmth he had never known. The media, however, caught wind of the move. Paparazzi swarmed the building, tabloids printed headlines like, "Billionaire CEO's hidden family revealed." Susan was painted as a gold digger, Richard as a reckless man hiding scandals. Susan wept at night, ashamed of the ridicule. Richard tried to comfort her, vowing to shield her from the storm. "You're not alone anymore," he promised, brushing away her tears. But deep down, she felt like an intruder in his polished world, unworthy of the grandeur surrounding her. David's joy became her only solace. He bonded with Richard, eager to learn, clinging to him as the father he never had. But the stronger this bond grew, the more Susan worried she was losing her son to a world she didn't belong in. Her heart was torn, grateful for Richard's love, but terrified of being consumed by his empire. The new home promised safety, yet it came with shadows she could not ignore. Pamela Eric's envy burned brighter than fire when she saw Susan living in Richard's penthouse. How could her stepsister, whom she had mocked as worthless, now be the woman at the side of Europe's most powerful man? Pamela threw herself into schemes, dressing in designer gowns, attending every event Richard graced, and attempting to draw his attention. She whispered into society's circles, spreading rumors that Susan was manipulative, that she had trapped Richard with a child to secure wealth. Vivian encouraged every poisonous move, reveling in the chaos. One evening, Pamela cornered Richard at a gala, pretending innocence. "You deserve someone who understands your world," she purred, touching his arm. Richard pulled away coldly. "You're wasting your time," he said firmly. "My loyalty is not for sale." His words humiliated Pamela, and the rejection deepened her hatred for Susan. Determined, Pamela escalated her efforts. She aligned herself with Richard's business rivals, whispering secrets, fabricating lies, and plotting to destabilize Vincent Group. For her, it was no longer just jealousy, it was war. And Susan, caught between her stepmother's greed and her stepsister's envy, became the unwilling target of Pamela's obsession. Life in the penthouse was far from the fairy tale Susan had imagined. Every morning, she woke to headlines mocking her background. Society women whispered at galas, calling her the beggar bride. The staff in Richard's mansion, though polite, looked at her with veiled condescension. Susan felt suffocated, out of place, drowning in luxury she never asked for. At night, she sat on the balcony, staring at the city lights, wondering if she had traded one prison for another. Richard, though deeply in love, struggled to balance his corporate empire with his new family. He often returned late, exhausted, leaving Susan to battle loneliness in a gilded cage. David thrived, attending school, learning fast, and winning hearts. But Susan's pride and insecurities gnawed at her. She feared Richard's world would eventually swallow David whole, leaving her irrelevant. Her breaking point came when a society paper published a cruel article titled, "From Streets to Sheets: The Beggar Who Caught a Billionaire." Susan broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard found her and held her, whispering, "They don't define you, Susan. You do. You're stronger than they'll ever understand." But Susan's heart remained torn. She belonged to neither the streets nor the skyscrapers. She was suspended in limbo. Richard's success had long made him a target, but now, with Susan and David in the picture, his enemies saw an opportunity. Competitors spread rumors that Susan was a liability, a distraction, a scandal waiting to explode. Some even plotted darker schemes, hoping to discredit him publicly. Vivian and Pamela, aligned with these rivals, became tools in their hands, feeding them private gossip. One rival, Alexander Graves, a ruthless tycoon, saw Susan as Richard's weakness. He orchestrated smear campaigns, leaked false documents, and even sent spies to monitor her. Susan, unaware of the danger, noticed shadows following her and David but dismissed them as paranoia. Richard, however, recognized the signs. He doubled security, growing more protective, but the threats only multiplied. The tension seeped into their relationship. Susan hated the constant guards, the feeling of being watched, the walls of luxury turning into a fortress. She felt trapped again, this time not by poverty, but by danger she couldn't understand. For Richard, protecting his family became his greatest battle yet, and he knew his enemies would stop at nothing. The storm struck on a rainy evening. Susan had taken David to a park against Richard's advice, desperate for normalcy. As they played, black vans screeched to a halt. Masked men stormed out, grabbing David as Susan screamed. She fought, clawed, and bit, but they overpowered her, shoving her to the ground before speeding away with her son. Her cries echoed through the night, her world collapsing in an instant. Richard received the call while in a board meeting. The words froze his blood. They've taken David. Without hesitation, he mobilized his resources, private investigators, police, even mercenaries. His empire shifted from profit to rescue. Days blurred into sleepless nights as he chased leads, interrogated informants, and unleashed fury on his rivals. Susan was inconsolable, blaming herself for disobeying Richard's warnings. She wept endlessly, her body trembling with guilt. Richard held her, whispering, "We'll get him back. I swear on my life." But behind his calm facade burned rage, and he vowed that whoever had touched his son would regret it. Richard tracked the kidnappers to an abandoned warehouse at the city's edge. With law enforcement by his side, he stormed the building in a blaze of chaos. Gunfire erupted, shouts filled the air, and in the heart of the chaos, Richard found David tied to a chair crying. He rushed forward, cutting his son free, cradling him in arms that shook with relief. "You're safe now?" he whispered, tears streaking his face. But the mastermind revealed himself, Pamela. She had allied with Alexander Graves, thinking kidnapping David would either ruin Susan or force Richard to marry her to keep the scandal contained. Her face twisted with fury as police dragged her away. Vivian, too, was exposed for aiding the plot, her lies unraveling in court. Richard watched them taken in handcuffs, his heart heavy yet vindicated. The demons from Susan's past were finally defeated. Susan, seeing Richard risk everything to save their son, felt her walls crumble. She realized he wasn't the cold man of that night years ago. He had changed, fought, and bled for them. Tears streamed as she whispered, "I forgive you." Richard embraced her, David between them, a family reforged in fire. The storm had passed. Weeks later, Susan, Richard, and David stood together at a press conference. Richard announced not a scandal, but a foundation, the Clara Raymond Foundation, named after Susan's mother, dedicated to helping single mothers and abandoned children. The crowd erupted in applause. For Susan, it was redemption, not only for herself, but for every woman who had suffered as she had. Their lives transformed. Susan pursued her art, opening a gallery with Richard's support. Her sketches, once torn apart by Vivian, now adorned walls that dignitaries admired. David thrived, no longer a beggar, but the cherished son of a family united. Richard found peace, not in deals or profits, but in the laughter echoing through his once-empty penthouse. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights, Susan leaned against Richard, David asleep in her arms. "We've come so far," she whispered. Richard kissed her forehead and replied, "This is just the beginning." For the first time, Susan believed it. Their new chapter had begun, one born from pain, but blossoming into hope. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.